Burlington Zellers. Here's what Innies found out a few weeks later.
When the Hudson's Bay Company opened its pop-up Zellers, the customers I spoke with weren't exactly Zeller-braiding.
This is not Zellers.
The overall experience was underwhelming. At the time, HBC said it wanted to delight customers with nostalgia for the big red Z. But the Bay may have had another motive. You see, a competitor recently slapped the Zellers logo on their storefront.
Yes, we do. We have it in the store. I even have it. I can even show you. We have it on our vehicles here. We got the Zellers logo and we got their phone number.
Robert Muniz is a director of a company calling itself Zellers Holdings. He and his family applied to register the Zellers name and logo back in April, after HBC allowed the trademark to expire months earlier.
Well, Zellers, their lawyers didn't do their work, then the trademark was expunged. They had enough time to take over the trademark, they didn't take it.
So now there's a new Zellers in town.
People are in shock. They're telling me, oh, you see, Zellers is open, because people don't believe that Zellers is open.
Muniz and his family have opened a store in Sorel-Tracy, Quebec.
Chez Zellers, avec l'avenue de la brise printanière sur la mode.
But shoppers shouldn't expect the Chez Zellers they remember. Right now, the store is small. It sells furniture. But Muniz says he's got big plans. A full Zellers shopping plaza. And yes, a Zellers restaurant. That is, if the family can keep the trademark. Because the Bay wants it back. HBC tried to re-register the Zellers name 2 months after the Muniz family. The Bay is taking this seriously. Le Zellers could be heading to Le Federal Court. HBC could have a case to keep the Zellers name. Experts say trademarks aren't just about who registered what and when. It's about making sure brand names and who owns them are clear to consumers. If the Muniz family wanted to open up a Zellers radio station, people would know that's not the Bay, but a retail outlet.
There's just way too much in common for this to actually fly, in my professional opinion.
Julie McDonald is a trademark lawyer. She says even though HBC seemingly didn't renew its trademark on time, the Bay has consistently used the Zellers name and logo for decades. They only closed the last Zellers stores in early 2020. That carries a lot of weight.
I compare it to sort of putting out, a nice piece of furniture that you're done with on the curb, and somebody comes by on a Sunday and, grabs it up and reupholsters it and it's shining anew. It's really not the case when it comes to trademarks and brand, especially these giant, really iconic brands like Zellers is in Canada.
HBC wants its curb couch back. McDonald thinks regulators will be sympathetic, but Robert Muniz says he won't surrender to the Bay.
I'm opening up a branch in Blainville, Quebec. By Monday, we'll have the signs up on the building. We're going to have the restaurants, convenience store, retail hub, and the Zellers Express, because we also have the Zellers Express.
So for now, the battle of the Zellerses will continue. It may be up to the court to decide whose lowest price is the law. For the Cost of Living, I'm Anis Haydari.
This next story first ran last November. Picture this. You're home, your dishes are done, you're settling into the couch with a snack, about to watch, Survivor, and you hear this. It's a text from your boss telling you to reply to a client email, like right now at 9 p.m. Well, could a demand like that become a thing of the past? Maybe. Look at Ontario. The province just enacted legislation that is supposed to give employees the right to disconnect. It's one of a number of ideas now out there that are re-examining how we work. So, will establishing these kinds of boundaries improve work-life balance? Or is there a different way to go? Our producer Danielle Nerman looked at another idea. What if there were no boundaries at all? So Danielle, before we get to no boundaries, let's talk about this right to disconnect.
Right, so it's legislation that makes sure workers get a break after the day is over. In Ontario, the new rules mean that companies with 25 or more employees will have to develop policies that allow staff to unplug when they're off the clock.
So laws like this aren't new. They have existed in other places for years, in France, the Philippines, Spain, Italy. We just saw Portugal bring in its own version.
Yeah, they're calling it the right to rest. So it's not a new idea, but what Ontario is doing is a first for Canada.
And not really a coincidence that it's happening now during a pandemic when people are doing a lot of thinking and rethinking about how they work. And of course, with people working from home, the lines between work hours and off hours, pretty blurry.
Oh yeah, we've heard it so many times. Canadians saying, working longer hours now than before the pandemic. They're getting burnt out. There's been lots of polls and studies about that. The right to disconnect is meant to address that problem. People need their me time.
I could use some me time.
Me too. But here's the thing. There are those who believe that the right to disconnect is the wrong solution to a modern problem. That it's actually going to make things harder.
Don't tell me not to email after 5 o'clock. That makes me more stressed out.
That's Jody Thompson. She thinks rather than the right to disconnect, workers should have the right to connect whenever they want.
Just let me do what I need to do. And you know what? If I feel like petting my cat at 10 o'clock in the morning and taking a break then, or taking my dog for a walk in the afternoon, or taking a little nap between 9 and 5, who cares? As long as I'm getting my job done.
So who's Jody Thompson? And do I detect just a hint of a Midwest Americana accent there?
Yeah, she's from Minnesota. She's an HR specialist, and back in the 2000s, she was working for Best Buy. She worked Monday to Friday, 8 to 5, and Jody told me she felt enormous pressure to stay in the office until 5, even when she didn't have any work left to do. She would not leave a minute earlier.
Feels like things changed for her.
Yeah, she went out on her own, started her own business where she helps companies implement the results-only workplace environment, or ROE. It's a workplace strategy where employees have complete control over when and where they work.
If I'm clear with somebody about what their measurable results need to be, whether they're in an office or on the moon, it doesn't matter.
So it's based on two principles: autonomy, you're self-directed, and accountability. You know what work you have to get done, and you get it done.
How much different is this from what we're seeing with flexible work days, like what's really come up during the pandemic? People going in the office for 2 days, staying home for, say, 3?
So with that, you would be negotiating when you're at home and when you're at the office with your boss. So your time is still managed by someone else, but not with this.
The manager is managing work, not me. I don't have to ask permission to go to the dentist. I don't have to say, oh, I'm coming in at 9 this morning instead of 8. Is it okay if I go to my child's play? All of that crap disappears. It is gone. And when you do that, it's amazing what teams do together. They don't just stop working. They don't go on vacation for a year and never check in, because they know they're being held accountable to results. And so they do what they need to do to get their job done, and do what they need to do to get everything else in their life done.
So the freedom of all this sounds appealing, the autonomy, but could an employer exploit the system, set results that would amount to a 60 or 80-hour work week?
Maybe. I mean, the devil's in the details.
And then if a workplace did go with this, take the traditional clock that we know, smash it on the ground, this is something that we're not used to, and this is pretty out there.
Yeah, the 40-hour work week is deeply entrenched in our culture. 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, and 8 hours rest. That slogan was coined more than 200 years ago.
Yeah, that's actually when the labor movement started. You saw workers at that time fighting for shorter work days, and that's pretty much how we arrived at the 40-hour work week we now know.
Yeah, and 200 years later, we're still expecting people to be in the office 8 hours a day.
When people are in the office, it looks like work. I go to meetings, I go around the water cooler, I'm, talking to people in the hallway. So now I feel like, oh yeah, that looks like work. Work is happening. But when I can't see you, you might be doing your laundry. That doesn't look like work. Walking your dog doesn't look like work. So now I'm uncomfortable. So now I have to figure out, how can I manage you? I'm going to get, spy software and all sorts of things so I can make sure you're working. Even though you probably weren't working when you were in the office. You were just in the office doing time.
So she wants to get rid of being at work just for the sake of being seen to be working. What's called FaceTime. What about employers? Are they going for this?
Well, it's been adopted by about 100 companies. And surprisingly, not just white-collar industries.
Really?
Yeah, even manufacturing jobs. She goes as far as to say it could work at a grocery store, where you'd have cashiers choosing their own hours and trading shifts among each other without asking for permission.
I would like to see how that works practically across a lot of different industries. As for Jody, you said she's from Minnesota. Is this just a U.S. thing, or are Canadian companies doing this as well?
They are. Her clients are ATB Financial, Mabel's Labels, which makes custom labels for kids' clothes so you don't lose their mittens at daycare, and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. That's one of her biggest clients. And Jody says more are lining up.
So over the past year, there's been a lot of interest in the results-only work environment, but we're getting the most interest from Canadian companies. And it seems like Canada is the most open to this kind of progressive idea.
So how would she say this stacks up to something like the right to disconnect that they're introducing in Ontario?
Well, obviously, she thinks her idea is better. I want to be clear that Jody thinks everyone has the right to disconnect, but they should do it when they want.
Thanks, Danielle. That's a best-of edition of The Cost of Living. Our producers for these stories include Anissa Dari, Danielle Nerman, and Jennifer Keane. Our executive producer is Tracy Johnson. I'm Paul Havershrud. Thanks for listening.
This is CBC Radio 1, 89.1 FM in Waterloo Region.
All praise the mighty offset spatula, used by bakers and sand sculptors alike to create magnificent masterpieces of both sweet, buttercream, and sand. From this day forward, Sunday evenings shall be dedicated to honoring the offset spatula with new seasons of both the Great British Baking Show and Race Against the Tide. Celebrate Offset Spatula Sundays, starting at 7 on CBC and CBC Gem.
I'm Amanda Pfeffer. Coming up on Ontario Today, the Pope apologizes.
I myself wish to reaffirm this with shame and unambiguously. I humbly beg forgiveness for the evil committed by so many Christians against the Indigenous peoples.
Did Pope Francis's apology live up to your expectations? This is CBC News. From CBC Toronto, here is the news at 12 o'clock. Mostly cloudy and 22 degrees. Good afternoon. I'm Jasmine Seputis. Before a crowd of thousands at Edmonton's Commonwealth Stadium, Pope Francis is leading a special mass this hour. It's all part of his 6-day visit to Canada that he is calling a pilgrimage of penance. Megan Williams is at the stadium.
Well, I have to say, looking around here at Edmonton's Commonwealth Stadium, the mood is celebratory. There are a lot of Indigenous people who have traveled here from all across Canada. Many of them were at the Pope's apology in Musqueam yesterday. But the mood is different. The Pope is going to give a mass that's dedicated to the elderly, and that ties in with Indigenous values, the valuing of elders within their community. So people seem very happy to be here. It's a very different feel from yesterday, which was a painful day for many. Megan Williams, CBC News, Edmonton.
A familiar face is hoping to be Hamilton's next mayor. Andrea Horvath, former longtime Ontario NDP leader, announced her plan today to run in her hometown. The CBC's Linda Ward has the story.
Flanked by supporters across from Hamilton City Hall, Andrea Horvath officially threw her hat into the mayoral ring.
It was something I did think long and hard about, but I really believe that my best way now, going forward, to serve the people of Hamilton Centre, to work for them and achieve for them, is through the mayor's position.
The move was widely expected after she stepped down as NDP leader following the June provincial election. Born and raised in the city and having sat on city council, she's a household name here.
I think she'd be good for Hamilton.
She's always thinking of the working class people.
But her opponent, mayoral candidate Keenan Loomis, believes her political history will be a roadblock.
The biggest concern for me as a Hamiltonian
is the ability of Andrea Horvath to work with Premier Doug Ford. I doubt that Andrea is going to be able to get her phone answered if she calls Queen's Park.
In a statement today, Premier Doug Ford wished all the candidates luck and thanked Horvath for her service. Linda Ward, CBC News, Hamilton.
The TTC suspended subway service on Line 2 this morning due to an electrical fire. Police say the fire broke out around 7 a.m. at the Bloor-Yonge station, shutting down service between St. George and Pape. Toronto Fire Services says the main body of the fire is out, but they are still on scene and riders should expect delays. It's been about 2 weeks since the province expanded 4 shots of COVID-19 vaccines to all adults. But concerns are cropping up about a slower than normal uptake of the boosters. Ontario Health Minister Sylvia Jones says she's not worried.
I am not at all concerned because there is sufficient vaccines, which is a wonderful place to be, and people who wish to have that second booster and it is appropriate to do so, have that option available to them.
People in Ontario between 18 and 59 years old who've had a booster at least 5 months ago are eligible to get a second one, and those who have had a COVID infection must wait at least 3 months before getting a second shot. A youth-led group in Regent Park is working to fill support gaps for vulnerable young people. It surveyed hundreds of youth about barriers they face when accessing support. As Farah Morelli tells us, one of the group's initiatives is a fund to help young people in crisis.
We realized that the best way that we could engage youth in the community is to have youth lead.
Fathia Rahim from the group Youth Empower Youth. It launched just before the pandemic started and used focus groups and surveys to pinpoint what...
Dated yet, if it hasn't changed. The new feed on Instagram, it looks a lot more like TikTok. And
Park faced when getting support. One of its findings, that youth workers often have to pay out of pocket to support young people in crisis, so it created a one-time $500 support.
And youth workers, obviously, they need that extra support as well to be able to help.
Issa Ali used to work with Youth Empower Youth and now works as a community revitalization assistant with Toronto Community Housing.
Having this fund available for them really helped them to support in a broad range of crises from youth, because a lot of times challenging to get funding to support youth.
The group has also created an online interactive map that shows resource locations for young people and runs workshops on art and mental health. With the Regent Park revitalization ongoing and displacement continuing, the group says their work to make sure young people can easily find resources is important now more than ever. Farah Morelli, CBC News, Toronto.
Taking a look at the markets now, the TSX is having a down day, 105 points down, while in New York, the Dow dropped 99 points. The Nasdaq also fell 156 points. As for the Canadian dollar, it's also down, dropping to 77.65 cents US. Turning now to the weather forecast for Toronto, Hamilton, and Niagara. We're expecting a mix of sun and cloud today, the high getting up to 25 degrees. Tonight, mainly cloudy, but it will clear later this evening, the low getting down to 16 degrees. Sunny tomorrow, but increasing cloudiness near noon, the high 27 degrees. On Thursday, a mix of sun and cloud, showers likely, the high still 28 degrees. On Friday, a mix of sun and cloud with a chance of showers and a high of 26. And that is the CBC News from Toronto. I'm Jasmine Seputis.
Good afternoon. I'm Amanda Pfeffer, and this is Ontario Today. In this hour, Pope Francis' visit to Canada this week, marked by an historic apology.
I myself wish to reaffirm this with shame and unambiguously. I humbly beg forgiveness for the evil committed by so many Christians against the indigenous peoples.
Queridos hermanos y hermanas.
Dear brothers and sisters.
Pope Francis' words repeated through a translator in Alberta yesterday. Did the apology live up to your expectations? 1-888-817-8995.
I am here because the first step of my penitential pilgrimage among you is that of again asking forgiveness, of telling you once more that I am deeply sorry. Sorry.
The apology came following a visit to the graves of children at the site of a former residential school. The visit on Canadian soil had been a number of years in the making.
It is a blessing to receive you and host you. We have traveled a long way to be with us on our land and to walk with us on the path of reconciliation.
Before he left, the crowd erupted as the Pope was given a traditional headdress to wear by the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner who invited him.
They were powerful. I think it came from the heart. So I'm happy with that.
An emotional event for many, but there were also those who wanted more direct recognition of the ongoing responsibility of the Catholic Church today.
I just feel really disappointed, really let down. But I wanted to hear, on behalf of the Catholic Church, I apologize for residential schools and for all of the atrocities that happened. And I didn't hear that.
The apology itself is recommendation number 58 in the Truth and Reconciliation Report. This hour, we'll talk about the work still to be done. For many Catholics, this act of contrition has been important as well.
One thing that's struck to my heart, I think was struck to the heart of all the Christians here, is how families have been, taken apart.
I felt for all the mothers and the fathers whose children were taken away from them.
My greatest hope is that with prayers and with understanding and with peace, our Indigenous brothers and sisters would be at peace.
The church may never be forgiven, but I believe the church can redeem itself.
As the Pope meets with Indigenous leaders and tours the sites of former residential schools this week, will the apology he gave make a difference? Today, the Pope is holding a Mass at Commonwealth Stadium in Alberta, but the processing of this apology has only just begun. Did the Pope's apology live up to your expectations? 1-888-817-8995. Our Twitter handle is at CBC Ontario Today. And again, our question this hour, has the Pope's apology lived up to your expectations? 1-888-817-8995. Our Twitter handle is at CBC Ontario Today. Our guest this hour is Nigan Sinclair. He's an Anishinaabe writer and acting head of the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. He's also columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. And of course, he's son of retired Senator Murray Sinclair, who chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bonjour. Thanks for having me.
What did you make of this apology? What was your own reaction to it?
So, this apology it fulfills call to action 58 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a 6-year journey the country took, spending time listening to 7,000 statements of survivors, hundreds of more of those who participated in the schools, thousands, tens of thousands of Canadians. And so the fact that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommended specifically that the Pope come to Canadian soil and apologize to survivors, and that was fulfilled, it's a good thing. It's a good day. It's a good day for the country, and it's a good event that's happening all this week. The problems in the apology, of course, are that this is a very scripted journey. This is a journey that the Pope is on, which I think the Catholic Church is doing a bit of damage control over their reputation, especially following the unmarked graves that have been found throughout the country. And then on top of that, the Catholic Church has really been seeking to rebuild relationships with its own congregations, its own members, many of whom are within Indigenous communities. The Catholic Church has a huge footprint in our communities. And so what we have is we have a very scripted journey. And so people are starting to point that out with the apology yesterday, saying the Pope is identifying that just specific members of the church did atrocities to Indigenous peoples, where, he could have easily said on behalf of the Catholic Church, like he did in Bolivia when he apologized to Indigenous peoples there. He said on behalf of the Catholic Church, the Pope said at that time, we apologize for the atrocities that we have perpetrated. And the fact that he's sort of making this bad apples argument is really problematic because what it does is it kind of leaves it open to say, well, what was the role of the church? And then he also identified to say the church worked with governments of the day, and it was governments of the day that were seeking these assimilatory policies. And so that takes really the emphasis off the church itself. And I think this is really to shield themselves from further class action suits. I have Catholic sources who have told me that directly. And so there's been some issues, of course, also with him not addressing the doctrine of discovery, which is the 15th century document that talks about the claiming of indigenous lands by European explorers because they weren't Christians.
I want to hold off there because I think people may not have heard the apology. This is the section, it is said through the translator so that the audience that were present could hear it. And you hear in here a couple of applause sections, but that it ends with this section that you're saying is that nuanced section that people are saying just stop short of a real apology. So let's have a listen to that.
I thank you for making me appreciate this, for telling me about the heavy burdens that you still bear, for sharing with me these bitter memories. Today, I am here in this land that, along with its ancient memories, preserves the scars of still open wounds. I am here because the first step of my penitential pilgrimage among you is that of again asking forgiveness, of telling you once more that I am deeply sorry. Sorry for the ways in which, regrettably, many Christians supported the colonizing mentality of the powers that oppress the indigenous peoples. I am sorry. I ask forgiveness. I ask forgiveness, in particular, for the ways in which many members of the church and of religious communities cooperated, not least through their indifference in projects of cultural destruction and forced assimilation promoted by the governments of that time, which culminated in the system of residential schools.
So this is that part of the apology, the nuance that you're talking about. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, why it falls short?
Yeah, so let's be clear that there were many people yesterday, including myself, including many others. The Catholic Church has a very big role in my family. I'm an Anishinaabe and I'm from Peguis First Nation in Manitoba. It was an important day. It's an important day. I thought a lot about my great-grandmother, so I choked up for a second, who lived with nuns, and as a result of her relationship with those nuns, which was very close, she was able to shield herself from some of the sexual and physical abuse that happened within her residential school. And so we have many important relationships with the Catholic Church, and that's what you saw yesterday. You saw hundreds, thousands of survivors who still have those relationships, hold them very dear, and respect that Pope, want the Pope to act honorably, and want the Church to act ethically. And that's where that applause came from, and because this is a step in that direction. But within the apology itself, as you heard in those two sections saying, I am sorry, he differentiates the church from the government itself, and or says that some members of the church acted with the government. He didn't say this was the institution that debated Indigenous humanity in the 15th century. This was the institution that went into Indigenous communities and banned ceremonies and banned languages, and then created institutions that did that violently and abusively to children. He didn't say on behalf of the Catholic Church, I am sorry. What he said was, on behalf of Catholics who acted with the government, I apologize. And that's a very specific way to shield yourself from further class action suits, that if any survivor did wish to take it upon themselves to hold the church accountable, you don't have a wording of the Pope to say, I am sorry on behalf of the church itself. What you've said is there's a few bad apples over here who acted dishonorably or maybe unchristian, and that they acted with the government, and so he puts the emphasis directly on the government.
I want to play for you Phil Fontaine, who worked for Met for a long time to get the Pope on Canadian soil to do the apology. Here's his take. Let's have a listen to that.
when I listen to the Pope, I'm listening to someone that represents the church worldwide. He's speaking for the church. He's speaking for the institution. And so that's the interpretation I give to the words that are been expressed by the Holy Father. And if we're true to our word in terms of healing and reconciliation, we're going to have to be able to forgive. He's come here before us, a humble person, begging for forgiveness. And of course, you have to take that seriously, because we also want to move on. We want to find peace and solace in our lives. And if we can't bring ourselves to forgive, then this matter, this burden that we've had to shoulder for years and years, that'll carry on endlessly. And that's not something that I wish upon anyone.
That's Phil Fontaine, former head of the Assembly of First Nations. And one of the interesting things that he says further on is that he thinks that the work, for instance, the subsequent work that the church needs to do, that the Canadian government needs to do, that this work is must continue, and that's his message moving forward. He sees it separate from the apology, that the apology itself, and that the burden that the apology has to carry is separate from the rest of the work that needs to be done. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, nobody knows this better than Phil Fontaine, and a very close member of my family and my daughter's great uncle. And so, Phil's been at this for a very long period of time. He was the original person to meet with the previous Pope in 2009 to receive what he at that time was called a statement of sorrow. And since that time, of course, earlier this year in 2022, the Pope actually apologizes and then comes to Canadian soil. Notice that it's a progression. That progression comes from public pressure. The Pope would not have come to this country if not for the unmarked graves found throughout the country. The pressure that the Conference of Canadian Bishops put upon the Pope to say that the Catholic Church is in a relative state of emergency here in the country. And so what that tells you is that the previous Pope was not interested in apologizing, was not interested in taking responsibility, was interested in making a very private statement of sorrow to Phil Fontaine and a group of Assembly of First Nations delegates back in 2009 during the days of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it's a progression. What it says is that the voices of everyday Catholics in this country putting pressure on their own leadership matters. And that tells you that the very promising, interesting moment is that there's a lot of work being done in the grassroots and front lines within Catholic congregations across this country to working with Indigenous communities. And what Phil is now talking about is he's talking about what's the next step. It needs to take place in a similar way. We cannot look to a Pope for even taking responsibility for this issue. What Phil is talking about is he's saying on the grassroots level in everyday communities where the Catholic Church, as I said before, has a huge footprint, there has to be everyday acts of reconciliation between the church and those communities, and the burden cannot be further placed on Indigenous communities to build a relationship with the church. We have done more than enough. In fact, what you saw yesterday was the tremendous generosity of survivors to almost, I think for many of us that didn't go to residential school, but I'm an intergenerational survivor, it is so remarkable to see the generosity of survivors who were taken from their homes, went through a horribly genocidal, violent, everyday, worrying about your life process in school. They're supposed to be the safest place of your life and in school. And still want to give a headdress to a Pope.
That moment when Wilton Littlechild is placing the headdress on the Pope's head is applauded by people in the room.
And I know Wilton, of course, worked with my father in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Wilton is an incredible man and has dedicated his life to this country and has dedicated his life to his people as well. And a lot of criticism over that headdress given in the Indigenous community. If you read my Twitter feed, it's by far vast majority Indigenous peoples are very angry about this because the headdress is the highest honor that we can give in our communities, in many Indigenous communities anyways. Not all Indigenous communities have headdresses. And I myself have been critical in that, do we always want to give our most sacred objects to those who don't fulfill promises or don't deliver on the things that had been hoped, or those who had been in many ways required to act honorably as opposed to doing it for doing the right thing. I've said that, but at the same time, I also, the generosity of survivors is a model to all of us. We wouldn't have ever had the Truth Reconciliation Commission if not for the survivors who paid for that out of their compensation money. And they gave the country this incredible 94 calls to action, which gives us a path forward as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples to move forward. So it's a beautiful, beautiful thing to see survivors so generous all the time. I think some of us want at times to be more protective of our communities and feel that our communities are continually being exploited when we are so kind. But at the same time, it is now on the onus of the church. And this visit this week will begin on Saturday. The impact of that will begin on Saturday after the Pope leaves, after traveling to Quebec City and Iqaluit. We will see what Catholic churches, everyday Catholic churches in Canadian communities will do next. Will they take the humility of the Pope and be able to work with communities on their own merits? The way that the Pope has, imagine this, back in April we saw on the floor of the Vatican, the exact same building that used to debate our humanity and say Indigenous peoples aren't human beings, we just take their land because they don't matter, they're basically livestock. And you had our songs, our stories, our dances, our clothing, and you saw the Pope yesterday, which I thought was far more impactful than the headdress, was when he put on the stole that he was gifted in the Vatican to honor Every Child Matters, and he put that on and then led the Lord's Prayer. And I'm not Christian, but even I was moved by that, because what that said to me was that the Pope was demonstrating to Catholics to say you must now do Catholicism differently. And that was remarkable. I think that was beautiful.
And I can see that you're moved. You were moved by that. This hour, we're going to talk about, what comes next. The issue of restitution, the return of Indigenous objects from the church itself, and of course those records that will help in the search for the names of children and other records that will help with restitution and reconciliation. But let's start taking a couple of calls as we move forward. Liz is in Toronto. Liz, we're asking this question: has the Pope's apology lived up to your expectations? What do you think?
No, absolutely not. I think he would have just done as well to stay in Rome. I think there was so much hope that he would say more for the people. So I am a white settler. I was raised Catholic. That's the perspective I come from. I was very disgusted yesterday listening to all the coverage. I really enjoyed the beginning parts of powwow, but the celebratory spirit. But as soon as he started speaking, what I heard was the weaselly words coming out right away. The some, the may. He referred to government policies. The most jarring was as soon as he listed all the list of abuses, which like spiritual, physical, psychological, but he purposely omitted sexual abuse, which is something that a group of survivors who basically, I guess, drafted an apology of what they wanted to hear. They specifically asked for that. He specifically did not include it. And I think he was, just as your guest is saying, he was shielding the church from further class actions. He referred to government policy like it was the government's fault. What I really want to see now is Catholics need to keep up the pressure. I recommend that if you give to your church an annual or weekly donation, that you stop and give the reason, or if you're maybe not that religious, that you actually leave the church and state that's the reason. Ease of things for him to be able to do. I would have wanted him to, in his frail state, to bow down in front of everybody on the stage. I wanted to see that. That would have been something simple. And I wanted him to say that the artifacts will all be returned. Those are simple things. Of course, I would also have liked to hear that he's instructing the churches to hand over the records, which has been something that, all the survivors can never. They want the records.
Are you a member of the Catholic Church, Liz, yourself?
No, I'm no longer. Actually, what took me out of being a member is at the age of 14, between 14 and 15, in the early 90s, when all the news about the priest abuse, and this was not Indigenous abuse that we heard about, but just non-Indigenous abuse of children when that came out. And I remember hearing the priest saying things like, oh, we need to forgive. Well, they're really easy to ask for forgiveness and just words of themselves. But it disgusted me. And I'm, to this day, I never regret that decision, and I'm so glad that I left.
Yeah, I hear your disappointment, Liz. There are a lot of Catholics who are sort of feeling in that same space.
So, I mean, that's a really good example. And Liz, I think, illustrates exactly what I said earlier, which is that the Catholic Church in Canada is in a real critical state. It's a state in which Catholics themselves are highly disappointed with the Church, continue to be disappointed with the Church. Mm-hmm. And I've spoken to everyday Catholics who just are questioning not just their attendance, but also their faith itself in an institution that took so long. I mean, this apology was promised, or sorry, it was not promised. It was called for in 2015 within 1 year, and then took 6 years for that. So, I mean, the Catholic Church clearly moves very slowly. And, the public pressure that I spoke about earlier was instrumental. But what I would say to Liz, and I would just, having watched everything, all the coverage over the past 24 hours, is the Pope has done something that I think has moved me anyways, and it has affected me, and I think many survivors as well. He really makes an effort to go and meet people. And many of the reporters have said that on the plane flying over from the Vatican, he makes it a job of his to go out, and no Pope has done this before, to go and say hello to every reporter and just introduce himself. Mm-hmm. And he does this also with survivors. He's given every survivor he's met a gift, and he's also kissed the hand of those survivors. I mean, I'm not sure he can bend over anymore, and he's 85 and he has serious ankle problems. But, I do see gestures, and I see well-meaning gestures from the Pope. So.
Worth noting that he skipped his trip to Africa. He had this a mobility issue and was relegated to a wheelchair, was forced to skip his trip to Africa, but insisted on this trip and going forward with this trip. So we will talk about a little bit more about that. Our guest is Nigon Sinclair. He's acting head of the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba, also columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Our question to you: has the Pope's apology lived up to your expectations? 1-888-817-8995. Our Twitter handle is @CBC Ontario Today. Stand by now for local news and weather. We'll be back for more of your calls in 90 seconds.
Mostly cloudy and 22 degrees in Toronto. I'm Jasmine Seputis with the CBC News update. A familiar face is hoping to be Hamilton's next mayor. Andrea Horvath, former longtime Ontario NDP leader, announced her plan today to run for mayor in her hometown. The TTC suspended subway service on Line 2 this morning due to an electrical fire. Police say the fire broke out around 7 a.m. at the Young Bloor station, shutting down service between St. George and Pape stations. Toronto Fire Services says the main body of the fire is out, but they're still on scene, and riders should expect delays. And if you're planning on filling your gas tank, you might want to do it today. After rising 7 cents on Sunday, gas prices in Toronto are set to jump again tomorrow.